Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming. I'm going to talk about alternative societies, obviously. You can see that from the words up there. But I wanted to start just briefly with sociology, really, which is the sort of my main discipline. I'm a sociologist mainly, although not just a sociologist. And it's quite relevant to the topic I'm talking today because really when I first decided to study sociology, so Michael mentioned, did my first degree at York, did sociology at York. When I first decided to study sociology, the thing that attracted me about sociology then was that it seemed like quite a critical sort of discipline. And by critical discipline, it seemed to me to be one that looked at appearances in society, but didn't just take the appearances for granted, that it looked for structures behind those kinds of appearances. And those structures for sociologists are quite often about things like power and inequality and that kind of thing. But I also quite liked sociology and wanted to study sociology because it seemed to me to be a questioning discipline, so it sort of questioned the way society is at the moment and didn't take for granted the existing kind of organisation of society. But it's easy to be critical, and being critical really sort of leads to the question of what's the alternative. If you're going to criticise existing societies, what's the alternative kind of society that you're going to advocate instead? And alternative societies has always been a sort of theme or a topic which has been on my mind. So this lecture is about kind of like what you might call idealistic sociology, which I don't know if there is such a thing as idealistic sociology, but there is going to be now. I'm founding it now. And there are various sort of main themes that I really wanted to talk about. And one is about communism, after the collapse of communism. And another thing I really wanted to talk about was about utopianism, which is obviously has fairly obvious relationships to the idea of alternative societies. But I wanted to talk about utopianism, not just in the future, but utopianism as something which can go on here and now. And I wanted to talk about human needs and self-determination as kind of objectives, the sort of things you might want to achieve if you're thinking about an alternative society. And sort of underneath all this and implied by all this is capitalism, which I'm not really going to talk about, but it's sort of underneath what I've been mentioning, which seems to me not really oriented around these goals that I've just talked about. So it's not really oriented around human goals, in my view, and isn't really oriented around self-determination, mainly because capitalism is principally about things like money and profit, rather than specifically about human goals, and mainly because it's organised around things like capitalist power and managerial power rather than sort of self-determination. And that doesn't mean to say that you can't meet sort of human ends in a capitalist society, and it doesn't mean that people can't have self-determination in a capitalist society. In fact, actually what I want to say is that you can achieve those kinds of things within capitalism, but that capitalism isn't really about those things. The whole point of capitalism is not to pursue those kinds of things, but to pursue other kinds of objectives. But I'm not going to talk about capitalism. Capitalism is just implied by some of the other stuff I mentioned. I want to sort of really talk first of all about utopianism, which I said I'd mention. And utopianism is a word, well, the word utopian is a word which was sort of first coined at the beginning of the 16th century by Thomas More when he wrote a book, his book about utopianism. And it's made out of different bits of ancient Greek, the word utopian, and it means a good place which is no place. So it's a good place, it's a thing you want to achieve, it's somewhere where you want to be, it's an ideal place, but it's no place, so we're not there yet. We don't have a good place. It's something that we may never achieve, or it's something that we might achieve at some point in the future. And often utopianism is used in a negative kind of way. So, you know, if you say something to somebody and they turn around to you and say, that's a pretty utopian sort of thing to say, that's usually not a compliment. It usually means, you know, that's pretty unrealistic, that can't be achieved. But I think we should try and think about utopianism in a positive sort of way. So if you think about various movements that have happened in the past or are happening now, so things like feminism and the women's movement, and things like the civil rights movement, and things like the movement for working class representation in politics, or for workers' organisation in the workplace, so trade unions, or the movement for the welfare state. If you think about all of these kinds of things, these were all movements which sometime, way back in the past, seemed pretty radical and utopian movements. They seem to be pursuing objectives which seem pretty unrealistic and unrealisable at one point. But people pursued those objectives anyway. And these past utopianisms turned into real kind of things that had real successes. And it often strikes me that people who sneer nowadays at sort of radical and utopian political movements actually sympathise with these historical movements I've talked about and actually sympathise with their achievements. So there seems to be a bit of inconsistency there and a sort of lack of historical perspective. And utopianism has all sorts of different functions, and one function it has is it can be a basis for criticism of the present. So if you've got a picture of an ideal society, some utopian society, and you compare current society to this ideal society, it's a basis for criticising the way things are now. And utopianism can also be a catalyst for change. Again, if you've got a picture of an ideal society, that gives people the energy to try and look for some sort of type of social arrangement which is better than what we've got now. So it can be a catalyst for change. And there have been quite some sociologists who've talked about utopianism in this sort of way. So Karl Mannheim and Ernst Bloch and people like that have talked about utopianism in terms of these sorts of functions I've just mentioned. And it seems to me that we really need utopianism for some kinds of questions. So, for instance, for climate change, I think it's really difficult to see how problems of climate change can be solved within existing sort of economic and social forms. You know, you can do things with capitalist incentives, you can do things with new technology to reduce carbon emissions, but the problem is so fundamental and so serious, it's very difficult for me to see how we can solve it without having a kind of alternative, completely alternative, different kind of society. So one kind of utopia you get is eco-utopias, ecological utopias. And you also get anti-racist utopias. And it's quite difficult to find a literature, an academic literature on anti-racist utopias, but there's a great book by a guy called Robin Kelly called Freedom Dreams, which talks about anti-racist utopias. And you also get feminist utopias, and lots of feminist utopias you get actually in fiction as much as in sort of non-fiction. And you get libertarian utopias of the right, on the right. So these sort of utopias are often about having a society with a small state, or a society with no state, or a society based on egoism or individualism, and that's almost like not a society. It's not having a society at all. And societies where private property is much more unfettered than what we're used to in our current kind of society. So you have these sort of libertarian kind of utopias as well. And if you go to the other end of the political spectrum, you can find Marx, and Marx was very critical of utopianism. He was specifically critical of utopian socialism, and what he said about utopian socialism in a pretty scathing sort of way was that utopian socialists had kind of dreams about the future, but these dreams are not really embedded in sort of economic and social developments. They're not embedded in the tendencies of society, the way society is going at the moment, and they're not sort of embedded in sort of current kind of contradictions. So he was pretty critical about utopianism in that sort of way, and I sort of sympathise with what he says about that, but I really want to look at utopianism which is embedded in current contradictions and which is embedded in current societies and which is embedded in the way society is going. So I want to talk about utopianism sort of now and not just in the future. And I'm going to come back to this. And another critique of utopias is that when we've tried whole society revolutionary utopias, they haven't turned out very well. So people like Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, have made this point, and often what people are thinking about when they make this point is communism. So here's an attempt at a really big whole society revolutionary utopia which turned out very badly. And for people like Bauman, lots of us nowadays have lost the faith in utopias, and one of the reasons we've lost the faith in utopias is because these big revolutionary whole society types of utopias didn't work out very well. And I'm sort of name-checking various sociologists here. I'm going to chuck in another one here, which is Manuel Castells, who in the last 2 or 3 years has started to talk about alternative economic cultures. And Castells makes a point which is sort of related to the point I just made of Bauman's, really, which is that Castells says people nowadays don't really want to wait for the revolution. They sort of want to live differently now. So when people are talking about alternative economics nowadays, they're talking about things like barter, and by barter I mean things like free cycle. They're talking about co-ops and mutual help. And Castells made his name in sociology by bringing in the whole concept of networks. So they're talking about social economic cultures based around networks rather than hierarchies. And Castells says about people who are looking at these kinds of alternative economic cultures that sometimes they're doing it out of choice and sometimes they're doing it out of necessity. And the ones who are doing it out of choice are ideologically committed to these sort of things. So they're ideologically committed to mutualism or cooperatives or that kind of thing. But sometimes they're doing it out of necessity. So some people haven't got any money, and that's why they're opting to go into bartering economic cultures. And some people experience hell at work. And so those kinds of people are looking at alternative economic cultures based around co-ops. And so I'm quite interested today and generally at looking at sort of multiple experimental utopias of the sort that Castells talks about, as much as big total whole society ones, and looking at utopias in terms of sort of localized and fragmentary utopias, as much as sort of overall kind of ones, and looking at utopianism as a process, so something which is going on now rather than some end state that we're going to get to somewhere in the future, and looking at utopianism as much in terms of spaces, so things going on in different spaces in society now rather than looking at utopia in terms of time, which is the way it's often been looked at, something which is going to happen in the future. Okay, so that's just something about utopianism, which is obviously sort of very relevant to alternative societies, and I'm going to come back to utopianism all the way through. But I've also mentioned communism, and I just wanted to say something about communism. And although Marx criticised utopianism, as I mentioned, although he was a big critic of utopianism, lots of people have said, well, look, communism was almost like the biggest attempt at utopia that there has actually been. It was an attempt, if you think about the definition I mentioned earlier on, a good society, which is no society, it was an attempt to create an ideal society which hadn't yet existed, at least not in this sort of large-scale sense. And communism was about collective ownership based on need. That's how I would sort of define it. Other people might define it in different ways, as opposed to a sort of society which is based on private ownership and is much more geared towards profit, which is, of course, what capitalism is about. And I don't really agree with what a lot of people on the left say about communism, communism in practice. I'm talking about communism here in actual societies, so like the Soviet Union or Cuba or China or places like this. I don't really agree that you can look at these places and say, look, these just weren't communist. If you're a socialist, you can carry on being a socialist. You don't have to bother about these places because they obviously weren't communist. I don't really agree with that point of view. It's true that Marx saw communism as a society where state power had dissolved. So it was his idea of communism was very different to what actually happened in communist societies in that sense. But these places that I'm talking about, these places that actually tried to experiment with communism, they did try planning for need. They did try and plan the economy according to need, which is quite a socialist kind of thing to do. And they did try and implement state ownership on behalf of the people, which is a sort of form of collective ownership oriented around people's need, which is quite a communist kind of thing to do. So I don't think you can say that socialism can just carry on. People who want to create a socialist alternative society, which is not the only kind of alternative society I'm talking about, but I don't think you could say that socialism can just carry on regardless, not affected by learning what happened in societies that tried to be communist. And I think there were a couple of lessons you can learn from those societies that tried to be communist, which are very relevant to everything else I want to say. And one is that they got stuck at a sort of statist, repressive, transitional stage. So Marx said, on the way to communism, you'd have to have this very repressive, statist, socialist stage where you'd have to fight back against counter-revolutionaries and people defending their private property. But it was a transitional stage. It was supposed to lead to something much more democratic where power withered away. Lots of these societies got stuck at that kind of stage. So I think if you're thinking about alternative societies, you need to think about whether this is the best way to get to them, the statist sort of way. And another lesson you really need to sort of learn from what happened in people that tried to do communism is Marx actually said you needed to go through capitalism before you get to communism. And there are various reasons you have to do that. And capitalism creates various preconditions for communism, he said. And one of the preconditions is, under capitalism, you get a fully developed proletariat with a very strong collective consciousness, and that creates the sort of collectivist, common consciousness you need for a communist society. And you need to go through capitalism to get that sort of common consciousness already, at least partially existing before you can do communism. And, what happened in a lot of so-called communist societies was that they didn't have that kind of consciousness. And people like Che Guevara and Mao and people like this, what they found after there had been communist revolutions was that people didn't have a massively communist consciousness, and they were worried about having to try and build that consciousness. So I think a couple of things we need to learn from what happened in communist societies is that we need to think of non-authoritarian means of achieving alternative societies. And another thing we need to think about is we really need to think about alternative societies where if it's going to be based on a collective consciousness, we sort of try and develop that collective consciousness now rather than think of it as something which can be discovered later on once you've changed to a different kind of society. And one of the people who talked about communism in a critical way is John Stuart Mill, who, he was talking about communism before it had really been implemented in any of these kinds of societies, and he said revolutionary communism is quite irresponsible and much too confident in its own infallibility. So Mill said, here are these bunch of people, they're trying to create a system which hasn't even been tried or tested, and where the details are unknown. Marx quite openly said he wasn't going to say what communism looked like exactly. That was up for people to decide collectively. And so Mill favoured a much more gradualist experimental socialism. Now, Mill's generally thought of as a liberal. He's a great guru of liberalism in the world, but actually he wrote some notes which were eventually published called Chapters on Socialism, which were very pro-socialist kind of notes, but he favoured a sort of gradualist experimental socialism now rather than a revolutionary socialism which tries to create some future which hasn't really been tried and tested at all. And he also favoured a kind of pluralist society where you have private property rights alongside various other kinds of forms. So these things that Mill said about socialism are sort of relevant to the kind of things that I want to talk about. Okay, so I've talked a bit about utopianism, and I've said a little bit about communism, and what I really want to do for the rest of the time is talk about various kinds of alternative society which you find within capitalism, rather than sort of alternative societies which you find beyond it, which is what utopianism and communism has often been about. So forms of utopia now, so sort of empirical utopias, so alternative societies or utopias which are practical and feasible, despite being utopian. And there's 5 sort of areas I really want to look at, and one is cooperation, and one is food, which might seem a funny choice, but hopefully it'll make sense when I get there. And one is work, and one is mobility, and one is about politics. So I just want to talk about these 5 sorts of areas where you can find types of alternative society, and 5 is quite a lot of things to talk about, so I'm using them more as examples than any sort of in-depth analysis of them. And just to talk about, so the first one I mentioned was cooperation. And you get various different types of co-ops. You'll get all kinds of different co-ops. I want to sort of to mention mainly sort of workers' co-ops at the moment. So you also get things like consumer co-ops and so on. But workers' co-ops are where businesses are owned collectively by the worker. So we've got plenty of examples that lots of us in this room will know about. So Infinity Foods in Brighton is a workers' co-op, and Magpie, who run the Shabatat on the Lewis Road, is a workers' co-op. And we have a bike hire co-op here on the campus, run by students. And some of those students are here, I think, who run that cooperative. So that's a cooperative enterprise. And so relating this to communism, this is a bit like collective ownership on a small scale, these kind of co-ops. And they're often not very ideological. When I've talked to people who are involved in co-ops, and I've asked them why they've got involved in it, they don't say it's because I'm ideologically committed to the collective ownership of the means of production or anything like that. They usually, and that's what I want them to say, obviously, but what they say is, my job was rubbish. I hated my job. My job was rubbish. I wanted to get out of my job, and this was a way of getting a job which was much better. So I mentioned Castells talks about necessity and choice earlier on. It's much more about necessity and choice. Or they say, I got a terrible boss, so I wanted to be my own boss, and that's why I got involved in co-ops. And one of the kinds of cooperative organisation which I'm really interested in, which has really sort of taken off in the last few years, is the idea of free cooperative universities. And probably the most developed example in Britain is the Social Sciences Centre in Lincoln, which is a kind of free cooperative university. And these are universities which are run cooperatively for educational ends. And these kinds of universities are often the kind of response to the way higher education is going at the moment, a response to kind of marketised higher education, which is very expensive. Obviously, students are having to pay large amounts of fees, so these places are offering education for free. They're co-ops. So they're also educations where control is by the citizens of the university, so they're being controlled by the students and the staff. And they're a kind of response to the marketisation of higher education, where universities are run much more nowadays by managerial power. So they're about free universities, about cooperative control. And they're also a response to the marketisation of universities, where universities are run much more nowadays to make, as sort of businesses, to make money. Rather than with goals of education and the public good. And these free cooperative universities are about making universities much more about education and the public good. And we've got an example in Brighton. We've got a free university in Brighton. If you Google Free University Brighton, it'll take you to their website. And the motto of the Free University Brighton is education for love, not money, which I quite like. It sort of summarises what this is all about. And that's another co-op, where we've got some people from that co-op here today, this evening, from the Free University in Brighton. And there were some other, I just wanted to mention 2 or 3 other examples about cooperative education. And the people I'm going to talk about probably might not have used the word cooperative for what they've talked about a lot, but I think they fit into this idea of cooperative education. So lots of you will have heard about A.S. Neil, who created the school Summerhill, and the school still goes. It's run by his daughter. And Summerhill is mostly well known for the fact that the students didn't have to go to any lessons. The lessons were voluntary, but Neil's basic idea of Summerhill was that Summerhill was about fitting the school to the child, rather than fitting the child to the school, was his sort of perspective on this. And he also saw Summerhill as a school where happiness was more important than education. I've been reading quite a lot about Neil recently, and one of the interesting things about A.S. Neil was he was a headmaster of a school, but he actually really wasn't interested in teaching and education at all. He was actually just interested in people's psychological well-being. So his school was very oriented around this idea of human well-being and human needs, which I mentioned earlier on. And another person I'm really interested in this sort of area is Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian educationist, which again, lots of you will know about Paulo Freire. He wrote a fantastic little book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he sets out his ideas about this kind of thing. And Freire talks about a democratic and dialogical kind of education, and he talks about an education where students set the themes, and the role of the teachers is to problematize those themes. So, we're used to teachers setting the themes, but this is where students set the themes, and the role of teachers is to problematize and question and make students think about those themes. And another of my favorites, these are great lectures because you just get the chance to talk about all your favorite things, is Ivan Illich, who wrote an absolutely great book called Deschooling Society. And Ivan Illich talks about education through networks outside institutions. So he's quite different to what I've talked about so far. Illich is talking about education outside schools and universities altogether. In networks outside institutions, and education which is delivered by people who aren't certificated, so not delivered by people like me and people like lots of you in this room who have all sorts of letters after your name and are highly qualified to be teachers, but just delivered by anybody who happens to know about the thing that you want to find out about. And academics like us, like myself and some people in this room, are quite critical of power. We're quite critical of power, and we complain about lack of consultation, and we complain about lack of accountability, and this kind of thing. But if it involves us giving students power or giving away our authority, we tend to be against it. And we tend to use discourses of consumerism to reject the idea of accountability to students. So if we're asked to talk to students or ask students about things, we often say, oh, well, that's just the market, that's just consumerism, and we reject that kind of thing. When I think what we should really be doing is using ideas of democracy to embrace this kind of accountability to students. And this is what Neil and Freire and Illich were talking about. And one of the things I've really been following in the last few weeks, which has been really interesting, is economic students at Manchester University and at various other universities. More and more universities are popping up every time you read about this all around the world, who are trying to challenge the sort of one-dimensional neoclassical economics curriculum they get. But the other thing they're doing when they're doing that is they're also challenging something else. They're also challenging the power and authority of their teachers to control the curriculum. Okay, so that's something about cooperatives, and I've especially sort of been talking there about cooperative education, an idea of cooperative education. So that's this is something to do with alternative societies. This is about an alternative way of running education, an alternative kind of educational society, an alternative sort of way in which you can do education. And I said earlier on that I was going to talk about food. Well, I'm not going to talk about food, actually. I'm going to talk about food countercultures, and specifically about Freeganism. So again, I'm talking here about food in relation to alternative societies. So Freeganism. So this is basically where, lots of you will know what Freeganism is. It's where supermarkets have all this sort of type of food which is past its sell-by date or its use-by date, and they stick it in bins and skips outside the back of the supermarkets, and it's getting thrown away. And bin and skip divers are people who come into those supermarkets' grounds and take the food out of the bins and use it, because this food is perfectly usable. It's just past some arbitrary date, some use-by date. And Freeganism is about more than just making use of food which you find in the bin. It's about something more than that. Freeganism is a counterculture which has important meaning. So it's anti-waste. So it has a kind of ecological meaning. It's also about the gluttony of the rich in capitalism. So we're producing all this stuff, it's more than we actually need, while there isn't actually enough for the poor. And one of the nice articles about Freeganism, which I really like, was written by a couple of people called Edwards and Mercer. I think it's in the Australian Geographer or something like that. And their article is called Gleaning, Not Gluttony, which sort of summarises this. And lots of people who are involved in Freeganism give that food away to the poor. They don't necessarily eat it themselves, they give it away to the poor. So there's a poverty agenda, there's an equality agenda about it as well. And skip divers, these people often target bigger corporate supermarkets, the bigger supermarkets that have the least good environmental records or the least good labour rights records. So there's a kind of ethical agenda about it as well. And also another thing that they're doing, another thing that Freegans are doing, is they're taking food distribution and food consumption out of the market. They're decommodifying food production and food distribution and food consumption, and they're distributing food on the basis of need, not through the market, or not on the basis of making profit. So these food countercultures, these Freegan sort of practices, are creating countercultural values and countercultural ethics. And actually, it's more than just values and ethics, because they're actually doing it in practice as well. They are actually practicing an alternative kind of society. So it's the basis for an alternative society. And you get a similar kind of things in communes or intentional communities. People talk about them as intentional communities nowadays. And you get similar kinds of things in urban social centres like the Cowley Club in Brighton, and Paul Chatterton at Leeds is a sociologist who's written about urban social centres as creating alternative societies within capitalism. And you also get the same kind of thing in squats and community gardens. Where I live on the Lewis Road, we had the Lewis Road Community Garden for a while, and there are plenty of other community gardens. And these are about creating public spaces which are for community need, and then resisting the use of these spaces as private spaces which are for profit. And the Occupy movement has also been about these kinds of things, about using public spaces for community need. Okay, so I've said a little bit about co-ops and a little bit about food countercultures. Food countercultures as sort of having some kind of basis for an alternative society. And I just wanted to say something about work. I said I'd talk about work a bit. Or actually, what I want to talk about is not doing work. I know my boss is here. I probably shouldn't be talking about not doing work, but that's what I'm going to do, about doing less work, less paid work. So having a society which is based on less paid work. In societies like ours, we have very high levels of consumption and very high levels of production, partly to produce profit, and we sort of fetishize work. So work in our society is seen as a noble and great thing, and people who don't work are seen as idle and work shy. So there's a culture around work being a good thing, and we work very long hours. I don't, because I've gone part-time recently, but lots of people work very long hours, especially in the UK. We have particularly long working hours in the UK, but I think the problem with work it's not mostly hard work or lots of work. There was a recent Danish study, I'm just picking this out, there are other studies which say similar things. There was a recent Danish study which was about depression at work, and the Danish study argued its findings were that the problem at work is not that you do lots of work or you do work too fast or you work long hours. The problem at work is the boss, not the workload. Depression at work is associated with low levels of control. Low levels of health and well-being associated with low levels of control. So I mentioned self-determination as a big issue I wanted to talk about earlier on. This is a self-determination issue. It's about control and autonomy at work. And we could have less paid work in society. We can do that. This would reduce production and consumption, which would have environmental benefits. We wouldn't produce so much, we wouldn't earn so much, so we couldn't afford so much. So we'd have less production and consumption, which would have environmental benefits in relation to climate change, which I mentioned earlier on. It would give us more free time for our own autonomous activity. So it's about self-determination again, which I mentioned earlier on. And self-determination doesn't just come through collectively owning and controlling your work. So co-ops is about that, and communism is about that, collectively owning and controlling your work. It's also about not doing that work in the first place. It's not just about collectively owning and controlling paid work, which I think is important, but it's also about autonomy from paid labour altogether. And what we could do outside paid work might still be work. So if you do less work, you might spend the time writing poetry or going up the allotment or any of this kind of thing. And this is still work, but it's autonomous work. It's work you're doing in the sphere of autonomy, as well as doing non-work things like spending more time with your friends and your family. And one of my favourite sociologists ever, well, maybe he's not really a sociologist, but one of my favourites is Andre Gortz, who wrote a fantastic little book called Farewell to the Working Class, which was published in sort of the early 1980s or something like that. And I read it at the time, and I guess there isn't a month that goes by where I don't think about something from this book pops into my head. And he wrote other books about about doing less paid work as well, so Reclaiming Work and Critique of Economic Reason and books like this. And Gort made a point which might seem a bit strange at first, which is that unemployment can be solved by us all doing less work. It seems a bit contrary. So he said if we all work less, all can work. So it's a solution to unemployment. We redistribute working time. We redistribute working time from people who do lots of it, too much of it, to those people who don't have any of it at all. So doing less paid work can actually be a solution to for those people who don't have any at all. And how feasible is this? It sounds like a utopian project in the negative sense I mentioned earlier on. Well, there are various kinds of things you can do to create the possibilities for a society with less paid work. So a universal basic income or a living wage makes sure that people have enough money not to have to work exceptionally long hours. We could tighten up legal maximum working hours. So in the UK, the legal maximum working hours are 48, which is not exactly a low number of maximum working hours. Technology could shorten working hours. So people like Marx and the economist Keynes and Gort, who I just mentioned, and Bertrand Russell, all talked optimistically about new technology making it possible for us all to work less, because you can produce just as much stuff with new technology, but doing less work. But actually what's sort of happened is that new technology has been used to just produce more while we still carry on working the same number of hours. But we could use new technology to shorten working hours rather than using it to keep up working hours and just increase productivity. And there are various precedents for this, and I haven't really got time to go into them, but probably the most famous example is the French attempt to introduce a 35-hour working week at the early 2000s. And just the other day I was reading about a great sort of experiment, which is at Gothenburg City Council in Sweden, where the council there has reduced the working hour of some of the departments at the council to 6 hours a day without reducing the people's pay. So their working day before was 8 or 9 hours or something like that, and they've had their working day reduced to 6 hours without a reduction in pay. And the argument of the people who run Gothenburg City Council is people are more productive. People are just as productive in 6 hours as they will be in 8 hours. So from a productivity point of view, there's no great loss. And in some of the other departments, they've kept up the 8-hour and 9-hour working day. So we'll have to check back on what happens in Gothenburg. But there are plenty of examples of this kind of thing. And in Britain, the New Economics Foundation have published a pamphlet called 21 Hours, which goes through a lot of these examples. And as you can tell by the title, their proposal is that we should work a norm in our society of 21 hours. At the moment in Britain, 21 hours is the average working hours that people work, and that includes lots of part-time people who obviously drag the average down. The New Economics Foundation are saying this should be the maximum, or it should be the norm that we work. And there were sort of class dimensions to this, because it equalises differences between workers and non-workers, because you can redistribute working time. It gives us more autonomy from the employer-employee relationship, so there's a class element there. It could potentially have gender inequality dimensions here, so it could free men for domestic and childcare responsibilities if we had a society with less paid work. So women have been very successful at getting out of the private and domestic sphere and getting into paid work in the public sphere, but it hasn't really been reciprocated by men. Men aren't really spending less time in paid work and spending more time in the private and domestic sphere, but a society with less paid work could make that more possible. But where women are in relationships with men, which is obviously only one kind of relationships, women are often lower paid. So in a society with less paid work, you could expect women to often be the women, to be the people who take time off, which would just further reinforce gender division. So there's a potentiality for improving gender equality here, for less paid work, improving gender equality, but really gender equality requires wider cultural change. So there's no automatic kind of fix here for gender equality issues in a society with less paid work. And I want to make a similar point in a minute about racism, but in relation to particularly different sort of areas. So, okay, so I've talked a bit about an alternative possibilities for having an alternative kind of society which is based on less paid work and how we might gain from that, some sort of ways in which that could be done. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about mobility. I said I'd talk about mobility and alternative societies, and I want to talk about global mobility especially. When people talk about having an alternative global society, the kind of things they often talk about are about having global government. In sociology, at least, that's what people tend to talk about. Or about having a global cosmopolitan culture and having alternative global societies around these kind of things. And I'm pretty skeptical about both of those ideas, mainly because I don't think they pay very much attention to the sort of power and inequality relations you get in the world. But I'm much more interested in, if we're going to have an alternative global society, having an alternative global society based around the idea of open borders, where we let people move completely freely without any restrictions across borders. And societies like ours, like the one we live in, justify themselves often on freedom. That's often the selling point. That's what we provide. So economic freedom, or freedom of speech, or freedom of assembly, or freedom of belief. These are the kind of things which are sort of supposed to characterise liberal societies. But one kind of freedom we don't really talk about very much is freedom of movement. And there's a lot of great political philosophers who've written about the importance of freedom of movement. And one of my favourites is Philip Cole, a sort of British political philosopher who's written about this kind of thing. And people in liberal societies make a big fuss about the right to emigrate. So we've often castigated people in these communist societies I talked about earlier on for not letting people leave. But we don't talk about the right to immigrate so enthusiastically. So we're quite happy to criticise communist societies for not letting people leave, but we won't let people into our own societies completely freely. So there's a sort of inconsistency there. And we don't remove the rights of those within national boundaries to move around, to find greater life chances. So we don't say to people in Kent who want to come to Sussex because there might be more jobs at American Express in Brighton or something like that. We don't say, look at all those people from Kent coming over here taking our jobs. And we don't sort of put up the border controls on the Sussex County border because people from Kent are coming over here to find greater opportunities in life. But we do if people want to cross national boundaries to do that kind of thing. So there's an inconsistency. And restrictions on migration, I said I was going to mention racism. Restrictions on migration are inherently discriminatory. Just by their very nature, they're discriminatory. That's what they're about. Because they determine your rights to move according to very specific things. So they determine your rights to move according to skills, whether you've got enough skills, or your family connections, whether you've got some family in that country, or your income, or your place of birth. And often what this actually involves is the rich keeping out the poor. So we're a rich country, we're one of the richest countries in the world, and we determine people's right to live in this country or come into it quite often on the basis of the income they have. So it's a rich country keeping out the poor. And there's a racialised dimension to this as well. Discriminating according to whether people can come into your country on their place of birth often has a racialised dimension. If you live in a country where most of the people have brown skin, the chances of you having to apply for a visa and having a lot of trouble getting that visa to come into a country like ours are much lower. So borders are a site of racism. And open borders can remove that site of racism. But a bit like I said with gender inequality, it doesn't remove the racism itself. Open borders can remove a site of racism, but not the racism itself, because racism is an issue of culture and psychology and history. And if you read somebody like Frantz Fanon, who I was talking about earlier on a minute ago to some people about, who wrote the book Black Skin, White Masks, he talks about this massively powerfully, the way that racism is not just something that you can get rid of by fiddling around with borders and letting people move around freely. It's a deeply ingrained issue of culture and psychology and history. And there's various empirical reasons. Those are sort of some fairly philosophical reasons about why we might want to allow greater mobility, but there's some pretty well-charted, well-researched empirical reasons as well. There's a fallacy about a set number of jobs which migrants take in a country like the UK. In fact, what migrants do is they're very entrepreneurial. If you're a migrant in the US or the UK, you're twice as likely to set up a small business than a British citizen or an American citizen is. They pay taxes. Migrants pay taxes. They spend their wages. So what migrants in countries like the UK are doing is they're creating economic growth and they're creating jobs by doing these kinds of things. So there isn't a sort of issue of migrants coming over and taking some of our jobs. Migration is actually a job-creating process. Average wages don't drop when there's migration, despite what you might read in some newspapers. The academic research is pretty solid on this kind of thing. Migration, average wages don't drop. Okay, apart from sometimes in the UK, average wages at the bottom of the pay structure drop when there's heavy migration. But it's not the migrants who are cutting those wages, it's the employers who are cutting those wages. So when wages drop at times of high migration, it's not because of the migration, it's because the employers are making the decision to do that. They're taking advantage of the situation. And the way you solve that is not by closing down the borders. The way you solve that is by having stronger trade unions or having a better living wage and better legislation and better enforcement of things like the living wage. And European migrants into Britain, who are the ones we talk about the most recently, their net contribution to public services is greater than the British's. The British's net contribution to public services. So if you take into account the tax you pay and the value of the public services you get out, European migrants into Britain, who get focused on a lot recently, are contributing more than the actual British are. So there's some pretty solidly empirical arguments of why migration, to be self-centred about it and selfish about it, isn't a bad thing at all for a country like ours. And you might think, okay, let's open those borders. It's going to be madness. There's going to be mass chaotic movements of people moving across open borders. Well, it's pretty unlikely, actually. There isn't mass chaotic migration moving across European Union borders at the moment, which are relatively open. Not completely open, I realise there are restrictions, but relatively open. And in the post-war period, what the British did is the British went to various Caribbean countries and they offered people's passports and they offered people's jobs and they offered people incomes which are much higher than the incomes they would have at the moment. And in the period between 1950 and 1980, 0.6% of people in the Caribbean emigrated. And it wasn't just Britain here, it's other countries they could have emigrated to. So here's a situation where you not only have a border which is being opened up, but people are being actively encouraged to cross it, and they're not doing it. And the reason that happens is because people aren't just economic self-maximisers. Just because you live in a low-wage country doesn't mean you're going to move to a high-wage country. That's the economic point of view. I started off with sociology at the beginning. The sociological point of view is people have roots in communities, so they don't move just in pursuit of money. Okay, so open borders can be you can have an alternative global society based around open borders, and I think this is about human needs. It's about people being able to meet their human needs, and it's about self-determination. It's about people being able to go where they want to go. Okay, so I'm just going to mention one final example, really, of sort of bases for alternative societies which you could find within capitalism. And this is around politics. This is in a sort of area of politics. And I've mentioned the Occupy movement already. I'm not going to mention that again because I've sort of touched on it. And some people who might have agreed possibly with what I've said so far might not agree with what I'm going to say now, which is really, I think, social democratic reformism as a place in building alternative societies. So if you look at the history of social democracy in the post-war period, what social democracy has done has built institutions which are geared around human well-being and human need. And it's built institutions which are based on the public good, so the welfare state, public housing, the National Health Service, free education. And Tony Judt has written a fantastic little book called Ill Fares the Land. I don't agree with everything he says in his book. He wasn't not very keen on things like open borders, Tony Judt, but he says that basically the welfare state is one of the greatest achievements of human history. So he says things like, he says, look at Leonardo da Vinci and Plato and Einstein and people like this, and he says, put the welfare state alongside those kinds of things. The welfare state is one of the greatest achievements of human history, and yet we created welfare states in countries like the UK in the 50s and 60s. In the 1970s and 1980s, we started dismantling these things just as they'd been created. And this is despite the fact that things like the welfare state had a drastic positive effect for my generation and for my parents' generation. So compared to my grandparents' generation, my parents and myself had great opportunities as a result of the welfare state and public housing and the NHS and free education, which my grandparents didn't have, and sadly, which my own children are going to have because of those institutions being dismantled. And the breakdown of the welfare state under austerity has especially affected women. But I think the welfare state provides an example of what I've been talking about all the way through this, which is non-capitalist alternatives within capitalism. It's not just about countering the worst of capitalism and keeping capitalism going, which is what lots of people on the left say. It's about building up non-commodified institutions so that the balance of society is more socialist. And in Britain, you don't get this tradition of social democracy so much, but in Scandinavian social democracy, there's a much stronger sense of this in Scandinavian social democracy, that social democracy is creating a society which has a much greater balance of institutions between capitalist ones and socialist ones. And what's happening now is that many in protest movements and the Occupy movement are fighting to defend the welfare state. Those are the people who are fighting to defend it, and their ancestors in the late 60s and so on didn't like the welfare state. They thought it was paternalistic and bureaucratic. Radical left social movements in the late 60s were against it. But these protest movements and the Occupy movement are now the people who are fighting to defend the welfare state. And social democrats are complicit in dismantling social democracy. The social democrats have become not social democratic, and it's the Occupy movement and the protest movements who are defending it. So politically, I've sort of been, some days I wake up and I think I'm a Marxist, and some days I wake up and I think I'm an anarchist, And some days I wake up and I think I'm a social democrat, and this should be obvious from what I've said so far. And I used to think this was a bit of a problem, which I really needed to deal with. It's sort of an problem of indecisiveness or, lack of coherence or something. But I think these sort of things, I'm not saying these things all go together very harmoniously, but I've been talking, in terms of alternative societies, I've been talking about all of these three things. So I've been talking about a transformation away from capitalism, so that's the Marxist bit. And quite a few of the things I've been talking about, co-ops, Freeganism and so on, or about autonomous initiatives from below, so that's the anarchist bit. And obviously just now I've been talking about reformism via the state, which is the social democratic bit. So these three traditions in politics are actually quite opposed, and I'm not pretending they all go together very comfortably, but they can all go together in creating non-capitalist institutions in capitalist society. They all do that. Okay, I'm going to wind up now, and I just wanted to say 2 or 3 things very briefly. So obviously I've talked about different types of alternative societies, so cooperation, especially in relation to education, and food counterculture. I chose food, but like I said earlier on, you can talk about counterculture in relation to a whole number of other areas. Society based on less paid work, open borders, social democracy, and for some of you in this room, there's probably nothing really new in what I'm saying, but I think some of the old ideas are often the best ideas, so I don't really apologise for not saying something new, because you've got to say what's right, and the old ideas are the right ones. And there's quite a lot of critical questions you could ask about the things that I've said, and I just wanted, in the time I've had available, I wanted to kind of focus on the positives, so I haven't talked about them, but I am aware about them. But I've been mostly talking about alternative societies which are based less on money and based less on sort of corporate and managerial power, and more about having alternative societies which are based on human needs, pursuing human needs rather than pursuing money and profit, and pursuing people's self-determination rather than people living in a society which is sort of characterised by corporate and managerial power. And all the examples I've used have been about this. They've been about human needs and self-determination. And they've also been about, I talked about communism and utopianism at the beginning. They've also been about having some space for communist and utopian principles within capitalism here and now, and not just in some future kind of society in the future, which is how those things are often mentioned. And the very last point I wanted to make was about John Holloway. And John Holloway is an author which I don't agree with everything that John Holloway says, but he's written a book in the last few years called Crack Capitalism, which is sort of about the kind of stuff that I've been talking about. And he uses the word crack as a noun, and he also uses the word crack as a verb. So he says, in capitalism, you find these cracks. That's the noun thing. You find the sort of thing I've been talking about, squats, occupations, co-ops, cooperative education, these kinds of things. There are cracks there where there are non-capitalist things going on in capitalism. But he also uses the word crack in an active verb-like sense. You can create these cracks in capitalism. You can crack capitalism by creating these sort of non-capitalist institutions. And he talks about alternative societies in the present, and that's what I've been trying to do, talk about alternative societies now rather than, which have a basis in the present rather than ones which are like involve a whole-scale revolutionary change in the future. And he talks about alternative societies which are built by ordinary people. So most of the examples, the social democracy one apart, although even the social democracy one was built by ordinary Labour Party members and trade unions and so on, but he talks about the alternative societies, these cracks being created by ordinary people, not political leaders. And he also talks about alternative societies being prefigurative. So what we're doing is you create kinds of society now, little pools of society, you create a co-op, you set up your free university, you see what happens. If it works well, you do it on a bigger scale in the future. So these are alternative societies which are prefigurative. They prefigure what could be a bigger possibility in the future. And he also talks about something which I quite like, is he says that crack capitalism is sort of politics of misfitting. So it's based by, the crack capitalism is built by people who don't fit in. So if you don't want to live a life which is based on making profit for a private organisation, you don't fit in, and you start to create alternative kinds of institutions. So there's almost like a psychological thing here. These alternative societies are created by people who are sort of involved in the politics of misfitting. And he talks about dignity. Holloway says alternative societies are about, although he uses the word cracks rather than alternative societies, about dignity. And he associates dignity with kind of self-determination. These societies are about self-determination, and that's really what I've been talking about. Alternative societies which are about putting humans first, and are also about this kind of dignity, this dignity of self-determination. And that's it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening.